It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce Joel Jeffrey. We call him Joe. We seldom call him Dr. Jeffrey, but I don't know why. Joe started out studying math at Caltech and went to grad school at Colorado University, computer science, and met Osorio. And the rest of it, you know, he started learning descriptive and went back and forth from one side of the campus to another. He's done impressive work, a lot of it with Tony Putnam. And he's been at Northern Illinois University, was there from 83 to 2011, mostly teaching computer science. He's an exceptionally smart guy. He can talk about behavioral economics, status dynamics, spirituality, any manner of things, and we're gonna be thrilled to hear him today. He's going to help make Buddhism accessible to us Westerners. All right, Dr. Jeffrey.
Thank you. Well, that's the goal anyway. We'll see at the end how well I've succeeded. Buddhism, let me add, and Buddhist language. Welcome, thank you all, both physically present and online present. I want to start by, reminding you of Walter's wonderful presentation at this conference last year on mindfulness. The basics of mindfulness, let me just briefly summarize a large topic, are to focus on one's breath, simply following it as it goes in and out. Or I guess I did that backwards, both in and out. And key is, as the teachers all say, let whatever thoughts, feelings, judgments, etc. arise be like clouds in the sky, the classic image. This is a very widely recognized technique in psychotherapy, widely seen as valuable, sufficiently so that there's actually been a book. Walter emailed me about a book reviewed in none less than the New York Times, widely known as valuable in therapy. I guess I should be over here. A key point here is that phrase, clouds in the sky, a perfect image for a distinction that descriptive psychologists and probably many others are familiar with, although perhaps under a different name, the distinction of a description versus an appraisal. A description is, of course, a description. The mask is black. This is small. The sky is blue, etc. It's simply a comment about a fact. As opposed to, as distinguished from appraisals, which are a different sort of description. An appraisal being a description that tautologically, automatically carries a reason for acting. The classic is Osorio's, that line over there is yellow, okay, versus that line is dangerous, which automatically gives me a reason to escape. To say it is dangerous is to say, that's the tautological word, is to say, I have a reason to get out of here. Well, this is classic Buddhism. Thoughts and feelings are spoken of as arising, and it is a technique, let them be like clouds in the sky, is a technique for giving those thoughts, feelings, etc., a different place in one's world, a different status, namely the status of descriptions, or mere descriptions, as Pete used to call them, rather than appraisals. The key point is, a description is just a description. It carries no implication for what you do. Thus, let them be like clouds in the sky. Clouds in the sky just go by. They don't give us reason to do anything. Come on, baby. There we go. So this raises the obvious question. Is there more gold here? A natural question is, what else might there be in Buddhism that could be valuable, either in life to ordinary folk or to psychotherapists? So naturally, we go to the Buddhist literature. And we find, as my grandmother used to say, oy vey, language that is difficult, sometimes flat out impenetrable to Westerners. I have no knowledge of how it is to non-Westerners. I have a suspicion that it's almost as impenetrable to people who are native Chinese or Japanese speakers, but it's just a suspicion. I have no basis for verifying it or disverifying it. We find language such as awakened essence of mind, the luminous emptiness. Everything is infused with emptiness. What in the world does those things possibly mean? So what do we do? What does someone do if they look at those and say, I want to know more about what those are saying? Well, one of the perhaps most obvious thing would be become a Buddhist. Do the Buddhist meditation until the meaning is clear. Another way to say that is become an insider to the Buddhist community. And many have done that and reported good results. Or we could do what we're going to do here today. We're going to see if we can use descriptive formulations to make sense of this puzzling language. And by make sense of, I mean, identify the concepts associated with locutions such as absolutely real. A little diagrammatic form of that. Here is Osorio's formulation of verbal behavior. Verbal behavior is a string of words, a locution, something you say as a way of acting on some concept, C. And B over there on the right-hand side is all the other ways of acting on that concept. So we have the Buddhist locution, for example, absolutely real. And we want to come up with a different locution, a different way of talking. But not any description, not any locution will do. We want some ways of talking that can be taken literally and seriously, because more experiential language probably won't help. As we go through this, we will encounter about 4 themes. I wanted to highlight them before we go ahead. First off, as I just mentioned, there's a lot of experiential language here. People talk about their experience, what they see, feel, etc., when various situations arise. Secondly, a lot of that experiential language is object-based and metaphorical. For example, Buddhist teachers asked, as we will see shortly, what is the source of these fears that arise in the mind? So we've got an image here. The mind, talking about being spoken of as an object, like an ocean in which things, objects, mental objects, if you will, fear, anger, joy, etc., arise rather like a whale surfacing. We'll encounter fairly strongly the difference between appraisal and description, as we already saw momentarily. And finally, something we'll make a lot of use of, totalities. Totalities is a word that we don't hear a lot about. You don't encounter that in the newspaper or online. Let's talk about that for a moment. What do I mean by totalities? It's a fancy way of saying all of something. For example, a couple taken from Osorio, all the points on the surface of the earth. We could talk about the totality of points, or the totality of all possible behaviors, or the totality of all descriptions and possible descriptions of an object. One taken from Mary Scheidler, the entire universe. From Swami Muktananda, a Indian guru, all that is and all that isn't, or all possible worlds. As we do this, I'm going to take some text. The text I'll primarily use is taken from a book called In Love with the World, a title I particularly like in view of what it's talking about, by a man named Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. Apologies for butchering Tibetan language. That's the best I got. a Rinpoche, which means in Tibetan Buddhism, someone regarded as an incarnate Lama, incarnate master. He grew up as a Rinpoche from small child, studying under his father, who was also a Rinpoche, and other teachers, a highly respected Lama master, in a highly protected environment, very restricted, very protected from outside influence, pardon me, all aspects of the outside world, which is significant because, as he reports, as an adult, as a teacher, he realized he had no acquaintance with the world of his students and resolved to do something about it. And what he resolved to do was sneak out of his monastery and immerse himself in the world, in the ordinary world that he had no experience of. No training in how to deal with these things. And what he did is he snuck out and he took a train, traveling in the lowest class to Varanasi, city in India. And I need to say before we go further, the lowest class on Indian trains is not like third class in Amtrak. As he describes it, it is dirty, it is noisy, it is smelly, it is tremendously crowded. People, to get from one point to another, you step over and occasionally step on other people because there's just no other way to do it. It ain't nothing like ordinary American encounter. This is his description, by the way, not mine. No, I want to be careful here. No degradation is intended. As he describes it, that's just how it is. He wrote In Love with the World about his experiences as someone deeply trained in Tibetan Buddhism, but who had never dealt with these unpleasant facts about the world, his reactions to these experiences, and the insights that he gained into himself and Buddhist teachings. So, with that to sort of set the scene, our first move is to recall what there is in the world is persons behaving in the world, of course. Probably the most fundamental reminder from descriptive psychology. What we call mind is a shorthand, an ellipsis. It is a very convenient way of talking about all those aspects of a person and behavior other than the physical ones. It's extremely convenient. We all use it. I'll be using it in here. But it is nonetheless a shorthand. There are no mental objects. There are people. Politically, we might say, there's no such thing as a mind. I once began a talk with that polemic formulation, and I will tell you what, it works. It got people's attention. Come on, baby. There we go. Accordingly, what we call mental actions are actions. Mental behavior is behavior. A reminder, I know everybody in this room knows this, but there may well be people not in this room on Zoom who are less familiar. So let me do a quickie reminder. Somebody's behavior, an individual's behavior, is something described with these 7 parameters. What you want to accomplish, your intended goal, the distinctions that you are acting on by doing this, the know-how, the skills required to do this, the visible performance. When I raise my hand, to use Ray's example, that's a visible performance. The achievement, the end result, relevant personal characteristics, and the significance, which Ray did such a lovely job of elaborating on a few moments ago. That's the paradigm case. And once again, for people less familiar with descriptive, that's the straightforward, unmistakable, If ever there were behavior, boy, this is it. But there are non-paradigm cases. Some actions, some things that we would all agree are behaviors, involve no overt performance. Paradigm case, the unmistakable case of that, would be doing mental arithmetic. If I look over at, say, Kathy, and I say, right now, she's adding 2 3-digit numbers in her head. She's engaging in an action, but she's doing it with no visible performance. We wouldn't say, well, that's just like doing nothing. Of course it's not. We all know what doing mental arithmetic's talking about, but there's nothing you can see. So our extending this, our move is to say, is to recall that talking about the mind is talking about persons and behavior. For example, repeating a phrase mentally, a way of saying with no visible performance, no hearable performance in that case, is the action of repeating a mantra. So when Mingyur Rinpoche says to us, the mantra protects the mind, a phrase which he uses in Love with the World, what's he saying if we translate this into person rather than mind language? He's saying that that repeating the mantra protects the person rather than the mind, protects the person from undesired states of affairs. Which ones? Well, could be several. At a minimum, engaging in other practices. For example, reminiscing, worrying, working on problems at work or at home, what have you. If you are saying the mantra, you're not trying to solve a math problem. If you're playing basketball, you ain't playing baseball. So by changing from mind language to behavior language, we can see that the mantra protects the mind is a way of saying repeating the mantra prevents the person from engaging in other behaviors that they do not want to do. So no wonder teachers use the short form. There's no sexiness, there's no punch to repeating the mantra protects the person from. It's not valuable as a slogan. The mantra protects the mind is a quick 5-word reminder that is very useful. I use it myself. There are times when I want to be meditating and I ain't doing it. I'm thinking about whatever's going on, what I got to do during the day, and I can use that itself as a mantra. Say, wait a minute, the mantra protects the mind. Okay, let's say the mantra. It wouldn't work for me to say to myself, repeating the mantra prevents me from. There's a point. There's a reason why we have slogans and quick reminders. Second move. Is to recall Peter Sorio's formulation of the concept of objectivity. For this, he used the heuristic example of shape. So coincidentally, I need one of these, need this, where it's more traditional use. Shape, he pointed out, corresponds to, is a way of talking about an infinite set where each part, each element, each piece of that set is an ordered pair. Sorry for sounding mathematical, it won't get worse than this. Where D is a description of a thing, and P is the perspective, the position of the describer with respect to the thing being described. I labeled this set script D to make it a little easier to talk about. So our set script D is categorically different, as Pete pointed out, from any description. It is a different kind of thing, but it incorporates by definition, by construction, all of the possible descriptions from any possible perspective. We could talk about this as the shape being the objective fact and descriptions being the relative fact. And that was Pete's point. He was getting at objectivity. We could, something he didn't do, talk about the shape as the absolute description and the usual descriptions as relative descriptions. And now we're getting into Buddhist language. So, whoops, back up. Thank you very much. So, here's a water bottle. You're all seeing the water bottle from your position. What Ray can see from his position isn't what Dave can see from his, which is different yet from what Greg can see from his. And now, if I've aimed it right, what Greg can see is quite different. He would give a quite different description, and so forth and so forth. So on the screen, we have a kind of description, a visual description. Whoops, back up. And here's a representation of the same thing, the water bottle, seen from many perspectives. And you can see different descriptions. Oh, this will show what is seen from different perspectives. And these are all descriptions of the same thing. And that same thing on this slide is empty because you can't put onto the slide the shape. It's a different kind of thing from any description. So we can use what we've got so far already to get insight into something one encounters in Buddhist meditation and some other spiritual traditions as well. By the way, let me say, I'm talking specifically about Buddhist language, but much of this same language is found in other spiritual traditions as well. There's no exclusivity intended here. One hears the phrase, hearing the soundless sound. What on earth could that mean? Oh, by the way, this is something that has become essentially a cliche, a joke. The famed sound of one hand clapping. What the hell? Most people say, what? What could that mean? Well, let's notice. Hearing something is hearing something from a position. It is an oral, not oral, oral through the ear, oral observation. So let's think for a moment about the set of ordered pairs where each element is S and P, where S is the sound, the thing you hear, an oral observation from some position. Let's call that set script S, just like you did with D a moment ago. Look at the situation if someone is observing that set S, that script S. What's going on here? Well, they're observing this entire infinite, by construction, limitless set all at once. It's not a sound. It's different categorically from any actual sound. And yet it's obviously related in that it incorporates all actual sounds. So someone who here makes that observation of that infinite set, we would not be surprised if on observing script S, that person reported, I heard something that was like a sound, but more. It was not a sound. It was like a soundless sound. By the way, let me add, I know someone who meditates regularly and he reports, he hears this. And if asked, what does it sound like? He sort of says, sorry, I can't tell you what it sounds like. It's like a soundless sound. And I checked this out with him and he said, Yeah, this is a pretty reasonable way to talk about what that is the experience of. That is probably a quick, useful reminder. Recall Piostorio's characterization of experience. The experience of walking across the street is whatever you experience when you're walking across the street. What we're looking for is ways to talk about what it is that people are experiencing. So this guy says, yeah, that's a pretty good way to talk about what I'm experiencing. Wake up, little Susie. Okay. Third move. Let's recall Tony Putman's formulation of absolute consciousness. Putman observed that each person at any moment is conscious as something, as some position in some world. Further, what the person can be conscious of is at that moment, is the constituents of that world. And by the way, especially for folks less day-to-day familiar with descriptive, since the Webb telescope is up there, we're not talking about planets here. We're talking about human worlds, the world of art, the world of music, the world of mathematics, the world of persons, the world of woodworking, all those places that are all-encompassing places for people in which people have positions. So as with shape, Putman pointed out, we could think about the set, which I labeled for convenience, script C, which is the limitless set whose elements are W and P, where W is a world and P is the position in it. So Putman went on to observe, what can we say about this capital C, script C? What's its relationship to consciousness? Well, most obvious thing perhaps is it's not the same thing as ordinary consciousness because it incorporates them all. It's limitless in the way that, pardon me, that we just went through. But it incorporates. The way that it relates to ordinary consciousness is that it incorporates all the possible ways a person can be conscious as and what they can be conscious of. Further, every way of being conscious, in principle possible, is part of this set. It includes thus every perspective and every possible world. So if someone is conscious as this script C, as this infinite set, he or she is conscious of all possible worlds. And let's back up for a moment and think about that. That's saying a lot. I listed 4 of this infinite set. What are the possible worlds of someone who lives on a planet circling Cygnus 61? Well, there's no way to say it, no way to answer that, of course, but it's a possible world. But that person is not conscious as any part, any element, any constituent of any world. They're conscious of as the whole thing. They're not conscious of any world or part of one. They are conscious rather of the totality of all worlds and possible worlds and all constituents of them and nothing else. That looks a lot like what is called absolute consciousness by the various spiritual teachers, particularly the Buddhist teachers, since that's what we're talking about today. Being in that state of absolute consciousness means being conscious thus of the totality of all worlds and all the constituents in them all at once, but, and this is a key detail, not distinguishing any element of any world. So if I'm in the state of absolute consciousness, I am not distinguishing water bottles from other things. There's a very unusual kind of state. How does it relate to ordinary consciousness? Well, ordinary consciousness, recall, you're conscious as something, as some position in some world. Pardon me. What happens if someone's consciousness changes from absolute to plain vanilla, ordinary consciousness? Well, that person has then got a position in some world. Descriptive language for that is they've assigned themselves the status of P, some position. So they have acted as one who can assign statuses, a status assigner. Well, let's not throw around the word status assigner loosely. Let's remember that a status is a status in a community by definition. If you are a conceptual artist, you are a conceptual artist in the community of conceptual artists. So is there a community here? Can we identify one? Sure. Where would that status assigner be a position? Well, what does it take to be a community? It's got to have members. What are the members? All persons that are or can be in the state of absolute consciousness. And as we'll see as we go along in a few minutes, the Buddhists tell us that's everybody. What's the practice? Communities have practices. Assigning a status. That's all we need is our practice. What's the choice principle? Treating all persons as persons that embody absolute consciousness, also known as persons embodying, and here I'm going to add some more traditional language, the divine or God or ultimate truth. We're not going to tackle the word God in this talk. That's a different, more complicated discussion. We might try it. Might be worth trying at a different talk. We'll stick to things with less baggage, like ultimate truth. Maybe. Okay, let's use our tools. Let's tackle a couple. Number one, what the heck is ultimate reality? Well, let's recall Putnam's capital C. That this infinite set whose elements are world, each of which is world and position. Now delete P. Remember Pete's move, delete this parameter, just like we did with the P parameter in describing a behavior. Throw out P. What have we got? What is the result? We have a formulation of the set of all possible worlds, all possible real worlds. It's limitless. It incorporates all possible worlds by construction. Let's call it W. Again, just a convenient label so we can talk about it easily. It's not a possible world, not a part of any world, because it's the whole sausage, so to speak. It's obviously, however, related in that it incorporates all possible worlds. That looks a lot like the formulation, a way of talking about what is talked about by Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhism specifically, as ultimate reality. Just as shape is the ultimate version, if you will, and doing some violence to the language here, the ultimate enlargement, expansion of description. A different way to talk about this would be to say, instead of something being real, this is a real water bottle. I don't think anybody would argue with that. You saw me drink from it. I treated it as real and got away with it. We could say this water bottle has reality. That's not normal. If I need a bottle of water, I don't say, please bring me a bottle of water that has reality, but I could if I had particular reason. It sounds odd to Western ears, but it's quite common in Buddhist literature. It's the way of talking, a way of talking, found a lot in that community about something that is an ordinary, everyday thing. This is a real bottle of water. Relative reality contrasts with capital W, our ultimate reality, our absolute reality. And we could say regular real things are only relatively real as compared to absolute reality. And relatively real means what we usually mean by real. Ultimate reality is this limitless set of possible worlds. In Tibetan and other Buddhist traditions, including Zen Buddhism and other spiritual traditions, the focus is on the ultimate rather than the usual one. And there's a particular reason for that, which we will get to. Come on, there we are. In particular, recall something I think probably everyone is familiar with, but sometimes the implications are a little less familiar. Recall something we all know about, I think, figure and ground. The classic is, of course, the two faces of the vase, which we saw in Ian's presentation last night. Much more aesthetically pleasing version of that, by the way. Thank you. I really liked it. If you look at the face, what happens to the vases? They're gone. We can't talk about them. If you look at the vases, on the other hand, you can't ask, what's the shape of the nose on the right compared to the nose on the left? Can't do it. You can't ask, gee, which of those faces looks more like a classic female versus male face? But you can if you're looking at the vases. So if you switch figure and ground, you see different things. Ordinarily, what we see when we look at a water bottle is from some position, raise or daze or Greg, what have you. We don't normally have occasion to talk about the shape, although we can. We're also intimately familiar with the notion of shape and how things look differently. It's not a big deal. We just seamlessly switch back and forth. But we can switch. I could say, let's think for a while about the shape of this water bottle. Is it more like a cylinder or a piece of paper? And then we're talking about the shape. And we wouldn't be thinking about, focusing on, talking about, able to use what we would see from any position. We can switch back, and ordinarily we do that just automatically if we need to. So the Buddhist language is accomplishing, or is intended to accomplish, a switch, a figuring ground from what we normally see to the ultimate. The teachers are doing what they can to enable us to focus on the totality, not the parts of the totality. In this case, the totality of all possible worlds. So when they say, this water bottle is infused with ultimate reality, it's not like ultimate reality is some weird thing like the old-fashioned ether or radio waves, a different thing that filters in, which is how it sounds to normal Western ears. They're reminding us that this is an aspect of ultimate reality. And they're doing that for a reason, which we'll get to shortly. Number two, okay, I think, identity. This is a pretty easy one for us with background in descriptive, I think. Mingyur Rinpoche says to us, and at one point in his book, I am a monk. I am a son, a brother, an uncle, a meditation teacher, a Tibetan, Nepali, etc. Which one describes, and in blue I have this on purpose, the essential me. So the language stops being customary here. These are labels. Empty of essential meaning, I wished to go beyond the relative self. This is pretty easy, I think, because to start with, we can all see these aren't labels. They aren't that arbitrary, trivial kind of thing like I can make with a label maker and stick on my controller here. They're names. They're names of statuses, or in a more restricted case, names of roles one is occupying in a setting. Relative self is thus a fancy, mildly confusing, because it's not standard, way of talking about something quite familiar, our ordinary places in the world, such as monk, brother, meditation teacher, etc. So relative self is a relative self is a status. But we're all familiar with the fact that no specific position, status, or set of or limited set of positions is the same thing as one's identity. There's always more one can be. And one of the famous, occasionally infamous facts about identity is you don't always know what you can be until you're thrown into a situation that calls for you to adopt a status you never adopted before, sometimes to your good, sometimes to your detriment. The PTSD therapists are intimately familiar with this. One way to say this is, and the language is a little, I want to go slowly here. You are the one who is all those things and more besides. The one who is a funny kind of way to talk. It's a mere pointer to, it's not a description. It's what Pete calls a purely nominal description. You are the one. We're not committing to any particular fact about you, it is identifying you as the person who, the individual who can be all this limitless set of positions. Or we could say one's identity, here we are back to totalities again, is the totality of all places, all positions, in all possible worlds an individual could occupy. Let's be a little careful here. That doesn't mean, by the way, that everybody can be everything. There are limits on what one can be, as sometimes people find out to their detriment. Let's take a look at a classic, one that drove me crazy forever. Buddha mind. What could that possibly be talking about? Mingyur Rinpoche comments in the book, the true Buddha mind, the awakened essence of mind, exists within each of us. What's he saying? Let's see if we can't reformulate this. Well, let's knock off the easy one first. Awakened. That's a very nice poetic way of saying one has a potential that is realized. One has a capability that is now one is actually doing. But what's essence of mind? Well, he contrasts it with outward forms. So what's an outward form? Well, what's this thing look like? It's kind of clear. What you can see is a description of it. That's its outward form. Well, we know about outward forms. Outward forms are descriptions. An outward form is what something looks like, how it would be described from some perspective. But If we look at that infinite set W, which you talked about a little while ago, it's distinct from every world and every description, but it incorporates all of them, as does absolute consciousness with respect to ordinary consciousness. Essence of mind, oh, come on, switch. Come on, baby. There you go. This looks like Buddha mind is what we call absolute consciousness, being in the state of absolute consciousness. Exists within each of us is to say this way of being is not the usual one, but it is one we can potentially be in. And the Buddhist teaching is aimed at enabling people to be in this state of consciousness. They're not just doing this for fun. They're not just doing it as a ritual. They're doing this figure ground switch as a way to help people acquire the ability to be in this state of consciousness. An easier one, if I've done this right, I've gone from hard ones to easy ones. Let's see how we do here. This is one we're more familiar with, appraisals versus descriptions. I mentioned this earlier. Mingyer says, I started with a body scan. This is when he's on the train, having a miserable time of it. I started with a body scan, bringing my awareness to the sensations around my stomach, the nausea. This was very uncomfortable, a little disgusting. I began working with my mind, now he changed this to more traditional Buddhist language, to overcome it. Bringing my awareness, that's a fancy, characteristically Buddhist way of talking about observing. I began looking. Working with my mind to overcome adversity, again, a traditional Buddhist teacher way of talking about doing what I could to overcome this adversity. So I began observing and doing what I could to get over this unpleasant situation. Briefly, I want to just mention something that may be relevant to ordinary folk and therapists. I'm guessing about that one. There's a problem with mind language, and we can see it here. If people talk about their mind as though it were something outside them, they're stuck. If I say fear arose in my mind, I'm talking as though my mind were not me, and fear were a thing outside me. What can I do? All I can do with that is fight it. And you hear this all the time. I fought the fear. Talking about fear as an object, mind as an object. If what you're doing is fighting it, that's coercion. Coercion, we know, elicits resistance. You're doomed. Because you're fighting yourself, man. The resistance is pretty much, unless you're lucky, going to be as strong as the force to get rid of the fear. And we hear this all the time in literature and fiction and how people talk. It's much better and more effective to say, rather than fear arose in my mind, to say, I became afraid. Come on. Right, I'm disgusted that this thing won't do what it does. Come on, baby, wake up. What am I doing wrong here? Am I screwing up here, Jason? So we talked about that. I'm going to skip this slide. Rats. So the antidote to this problematic way of thinking and talking is translate from object language to person and action language. When we encounter this, maybe in our own daily thinking, maybe in reading Buddhist literature or other spiritual literature, ask, what is this problematic sentence saying about the person and what they're doing? This can, in principle, enable you to change your appraisals into mere descriptions. And mere descriptions, recall, are descriptions that do not commit you to an action. They have no impact, another way to say that. Let me emphasize the phrase there, parenthetical phrase, in principle. Mingyur Rinpoche is a highly trained Tibetan Buddhist teacher, has been doing this since young childhood. It's not necessarily easy. It's a skill to change from an appraisal to a description. But skills, we all know, are acquired by engaging in the social practices requiring the use of those skills. So it's not quick and easy and simple, at least not most of the time, but it can be learned. Let me take a look. I think I'm getting a little short on time. I want to may skip this one. Let me skip to the end of this slide because it's an elaboration of what we've done before, focusing on the fact that appraisals are not objects. They're not mental objects. They are descriptions given by a person. You, if you're the person you're talking about, acquiring this ability to switch from an appraisal to a description, and so, or sometimes to change the weight one gives the reason that is embodied in, that is part of the appraisal. For example, the weight given to the danger, to the reason to escape. If I see the lion in the room, all of these become more possible as you practice. It's a 2 or 3 things that I've lumped together under the phrase managing appraisals. This is a skill or a group of skills one can acquire. Whoops. Which is one of the payoffs of meditation, including mindfulness training, by the way. Number 6. Okay. Oh, thank you. I think I can do this. What do the Buddhists mean by no self? What does Mingyur Rinpoche mean when he says, I'm seeing no self arose? It doesn't mean, let's do this in a different order, seeing as though no one's there, which is how it sort of sounds. A person's always in some position, observing from that position, but the Buddhists remind us that a person is not only that particular set of statuses they think of themselves as having. They are the individual with an infinite set of possible statuses available to them. In principle, no self is referring to the fact that we can see as an individual who can be this unlimited set. So finally we get to the punchline. Let's see if we can't tackle. I'm going to skip ahead and skip back. This is more elaborate. A classic, maybe the paradigm case. What could it possibly mean to say everything is infused with emptiness? This phrase combines several of the concepts we've just looked at. What's emptiness? I'm going to skip a couple of these because I think we can get by without them because I'm a little short on time here, as Dave reminded me. Let's remember our friend figure ground and switching figure and ground. What if a person is unable to make any of the distinctions necessary to identify any of the things in front of them? If I don't know what the heck a water bottle is, I can't see water bottles. If I don't know what that oddly shaped object is over there, I can't see a video camera. For me, then, you could not, if I didn't know what that was, you couldn't say to me, "Oops, that's a video camera." You would say for him, that's an oddly shaped black object with 3 legs and some cords hanging from it. You could not say he sees a video camera. What if the person lacks or refrains from making all the distinctions necessary to identify anything? Well, then there's nothing there, is there? If I'm not making any distinctions, there's nothing there for me. I could describe that ex post facto as emptiness. You could say there's emptiness here, not to be confused with a blank space. That's the way in which it makes some sense to say there's nothing present. Doesn't mean you physically disappeared that funny shaped physical object over there. There's not that kind of magic here. So ordinarily, again, recalling figure and ground, what you see as you look up here is a podium and another funny shaped object and a guy giving a presentation. That's the figure. Everything else is the ground. Thank you. The Buddhist teachers are reminding us that we can take that word, everything, and do, sorry about this, an ultimate expansion to everything that is or could be, all the worlds, all the possible worlds. And if we do that, if that becomes our figure, rather than the ground, as it normally is, then there's nothing there, but everything, but if we're simply seeing it, there's nothing present. Thus, we can say every view of the water bottle is infused with its shape. A double play is infused with baseball, although you'd probably be shot if you did that on camera on a sports presentation. Everything is an aspect of ultimate reality, which incorporates everything, but which, when seen, because you're making no distinctions, is empty. Just as the center of a water bottle slide was empty. That's what infused with emptiness means. You see everything, but it's empty when seen. Thank you. I just about made it.
So I have a suggestion, since there was no time for.
Yeah, I did it again.
I want to ask,
My apologies. I do it every time.
have we got CJ on Zoom? CJ, you've heard this. I've seen your, can we take 10 minutes? And instead of starting you at 20 after, can you start at 11:30? So we can have some time for interaction with Joe?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you.
Run over here.
You got 10.
Okay.
The other thing I was going to say is sometimes when we were just on Zoom, we just left things open for people to discuss. People could leave for their break, but they could stay. So we can do a little of that.
Thank you, Joe. That was truly amazing. And I will have to study your,
Oh, thanks.
I will have to study your slides. I did a much shorter presentation of this in Advances 8. I'll
Oh,
just briefly quote from Pete on the concept of the void or emptiness.
oh,
And he said, if you ask what is the source of everything that is, then it has to be a void. Since if it is the source of everything, then there is nothing left over. But it can't just be a void, since everything came out of it.
very nice. Thank you. I'll have to go back and reread that.
Joe's Hap. I'm curious in the way that you were talking about things as basically observations as mere description, but you were setting it apart from an appraisal, but that an appraisal in AOC, actor, observer, critic, is a description with motivational significance. So, but you were staying away from the role of observer, describing things as a role of observer. You just kept saying mere description.
Uh-huh.
And so I kept kind of catching on that. And I'm wondering why you chose that way of just of talking about things in making all the points that you did, rather than, you know, why didn't you just go to the saying, you know, an observer role?
I guess because as I guess because as I was reading this and thinking it through and puzzling it out, what came to mind directly was observations and appraisals. Certainly you can say you could switch to observer and critic. There's nothing wrong with that. There might actually be a lot of value in it. Because a lot of people, thinking again about Walter's presentation, spend a lot too much of their time in the role of critic, making appraisals and switching from being a critic to being an observer. It's just what came to mind is, gee, the payoff that I found at the moment was in thinking about descriptions versus appraisals, but that's what I stuck with. No deeper reason than that. That's where I seemed to be getting the mileage, so I ran with it.
I see a
Call on Walter. I never see him do this.
Wow. Oh, I'm Walter. That's my absolute position. Wow. And as
Thank you.
just a comment that it's only at a descriptive conference that I could hear something like this. And another comment is that there are persons who have a natural disposition to occupy the kind of position that you're describing there as a
Mhm.
personal characteristic,
You bet.
that they have a natural disposition. And you may discern this from a basic stance that they have that may be somewhat more diffuse yet present. And personality descriptions have very little to say about that, I think, except
Yeah.
for
And they'll
the
call.
person descriptions that can be found in astrology.
Oh, wow.
In astrology, there will be a
Hand is raised now.
description of very much this kind of position,
Oh.
of that person who has this disposition
Uh-huh.
to occupy this position.
Oh.
That's all.
Give us a hint. And what sign is that?
Pisces,
Is that right?
indeed. And
Okay.
and it has a logical continuity to the start of it, which is just the next one, which is the very first one, which is action for the sake of action, which is Aries. So the
yes.
elegance of that configuration is there. But again, I just wanted to make this comment that this kind of position that someone may have a naturally intuitive readiness to adopt is
Yeah.
something that is not generally articulated in standard psychology.
Mhm.
Is in astrology.
Yeah.
Am I on? Have I got the audio?
Yes.
Thank you. Not only do I agree with everything,
Say who you are.
with everything I've heard in the last hour, I think it's a shame that Joe is fully retired and he doesn't have a cadre of students who could explore the implications of his current insights. And I think we ought to look at ways that that activity might be supported. A lot more springs to mind, but let's keep talking.
Thanks, Paul.
All right, and Errol has his hand up.
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, I just wanted to also mention that article, Tony Putman's article, When Worlds Collide, applies very much in some of these kinds of distinctions as well. And I actually just wanted to share that after reading his paper, it sort of helped me to understand something that I had read previously in a book that was written by a Zen Buddhist that was, intending to kind of communicate a concept that I had always kind of wrestled with, which was this idea that something can be two things and one thing at the same time. Being a better description of kind of ridding oneself of duality is, rather than saying it's one thing as opposed to two things, you have to be able to kind of say it's one thing and two things simultaneously. And when I first read that, I was like, I don't understand that sentence at all, coming from a more Western kind of educational system. And but then reading that article really kind of opened my eyes up to what was meant by this person writing from a completely otherwise hard to comprehend perspective for me, just by sort of explaining that it depends on which perspective you're looking at, kind of like with the water bottle thing. So I just wanted to kind of add that in there, that descriptive has such a nice way of communicating something in this sort of mutually comprehensible way.
Thank you.
2 minutes left. Do we have any other comments, or any of the chat people want to say something instead of just chatting on Zoom so the rest of us can hear it?
I would like to comment on the value of the figure ground as somebody who's struggled with this kind of conceptualization and meditation practice for decades. It gets away from when you're seeing the particular, when you're trying to meditate, that's wrong. And when you aren't seeing the particular, that's right. It's just like you're just switching the way the figure ground. And so it's so simple. You're just switching the figure ground. It's not whether you're doing it right or wrong. Does that make sense?
Doesn't me.
Right. All right, we're at 11:20, so let's take a 10-minute break.